I don't care what country you're from. I don't have a connection to a country. And I also know through my dad that nationalism is an extremely recent, relatively in history, phenomenon. It's like 150 years old, the concept of nationalism. It's not something that 300 years ago anyone would be like, I'm Ukrainian or I'm French or I'm Austrian. Like, that's just a new concept, of course, of history.
To War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. This is an exciting episode. The past couple of episodes, we've had a psychiatrist, a rabbi, an activist, and we're going back to my roots. We have a comedian on the show. Welcome, Ethan Stanislawski.
Hi there. Thank you. Yeah, that sounds like walked into a bar joke, the last three guests you had.
Yeah, literally. Yeah, how many podcast guests does it take to screw in a light bulb? I'm excited. So you
Yeah.
have a show that is touring. So tell us about Jew Interrupted, which excellent title right off the bat.
Yeah, no, I wanted something catchy, and it's not a pure comedy show. There's obviously, I have been doing stand-up for 15 years, but it is the kind of thing where I've also done storytelling, and it's more like one-person show storytelling, though there are a lot of funny moments in it. And it basically covers my background. So just to give some background, my father, Michael Stanislawski, is a professor of Jewish history at Columbia University, and he's been there for 44 years. He's the longest tenured member of the history department. And I always say at Columbia, the last 2 years, it may have been the most dramatic of those 44. So that there's a lot going on there. There's a lot to mine there. And on my mom's side, my grandfather, whose name was Sumner Kaplan, was influential Jewish politician in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is the most Jewish suburb of Boston you could possibly imagine. But he was the first Jew and the first Democrat elected to the state house from there. And so he was incredible figure in my life, as was my dad. So I really focus on the personal dynamics and, I grew up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, technically Morningside Heights, but I went to school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and what the Jewish community was like at that time, where it was like being a part of the Jewish community while having a Jewish history professor as a father, and all the cognitive dissonance that could come from that in a lot of ways. Some of the issues I had growing up there, just both personal with therapy and things like that, and the psychological impact, and how that all relates to Israel, both past and present, and some things I've learned along the way, and certain opinions influenced me to some extent, and post October 7th, some other things have influenced me to probably a larger extent, but it's a lot to mine. There's a lot of perspectives that I have seen, and some that I had seen before October 7th, some that I haven't. I really try to make it focus on my family, though, and just how that dynamic plays into that. It's a love letter to my family, even with some of the differences we have along the way.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Most people, they hear Jewish history professor and they'd assume right wing, even though Columbia is the den of radical leftist indoctrination. But no, your dad was the left wing counterweight, eh? Or
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, he has kept a lot of his politics close to vest, and I respect that. I don't want to do violate that, but he is a lot more progressive on Israel. I always say he's sort of the equivalent of what an Israeli leftist would be. To some extent, he still, he has a lot of close ties to Israel, a lot of close friends and, colleagues who are all very tied to Israel with a wild diversity of opinions on that. But he himself has always kept up to date, even though his history focused more on 18th and 19th century, going back to 17th century Jewish politics. He's written 2 books studying Zionism. And all that takes in. So it's very interesting to have a book on my bookshelf that's called Zionism, A Very Short Introduction, that says to Ethan with all my love in the inscription in it. So that's a weird
Yeah.
situation I have right now. But he's a really dedicated scholar, a brilliant scholar. It's the kind of thing where he just knows so much about past, present, future, or what's left of it, of the Israel and everything that's happened there with Zionism. So he's a really gifted scholar, and that was sort of the legacy I was raised with. I've lived in the Columbia area my whole life. It's what I knew. Like, it was surreal watching that campus, which I've walked through thousands of times in my life, literally thousands of times in my life, just have all that chaos. 2 years ago or almost 2 years ago at this point, year and a half ago. And it was really sad for me. It was sad for him too. I think he focused a lot on, in terms of his politics, on a lot of domestic issues in Israel, but he's also, a very empathetic person and has a lot of like mourning over what's been happening the last 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. I like how you talk about Shiva and morning rituals in the play in the show, because that truly is, yeah, my relationship to Jewishness and Judaism has been all over the map, especially over the last 2 years. But one thing I keep coming back to is how we do rock at morning.
Yeah.
Like, if that was genius work on our forefathers' part to force us in our darkest moments. They're like, no, you need to be in the company of at least 9 other people.
Yeah.
If you want to get these mitzvot done, like,
Yeah.
you're gonna sit in it. You're gonna have people bring you food. It like predates like the link tree, or what is it, like food tree, that like there's some like Silicon Valley startup that has monetized Shiva by figuring out a way to like get people to sign up for meals and stuff, when that was our thing. We invented that.
Yeah, no, and it's a year-long process.
And
So we have that immediate mourning period, which is, intense, and there's a lot going on. But then it's like a whole year and a year and a month, technically, where you cycle through the grief cycle. And one of the things I talk about in the show is that, and my dad's talked about repeatedly, is that what, psychologists, study in terms of the grief cycle uncannily matches the traditional Jewish rituals of grief and like the pattern and the timeline of it. It's pretty bleak to say that I think the best thing Jews do is die, mourn
yes.
effectively.
Yeah.
But there is like, I'm not religious anymore. Really, I don't practice it. I grew up I went to 8 years of Hebrew school, and 5 or 6 of that was a Jewish day school. So all those prayers are burnt into my brain, like, hard. Like, I can still recite Oseh Shalom by memory, even though I've barely been to a synagogue except for funerals in the last 10, 15 years. But it is, it's the part of the religion that I still value. I will say the Mourner's Kaddish when it's the right time to do that.
Yeah.
And, that's the kind of thing. And I will go through the rituals for people. Like my grandmother, I talk in the show about my grandmother dying right as everything was happening on the encampments and the protests. She was 103, and it was important to me to go
Wow.
through those mourning rituals. It was really important for me to go to like the Shiva and the funeral, even though the politics of a lot of the people who were attending and the rabbi who were attending were not mine at all. And I was also going through sort of my awakening of what has actually not just gone on in Palestine recently, but throughout the history, which I was raised with a certain perspective. Not, my dad would give me, like, the way I always describe it was I'd go to Hebrew school and I would be taught a specific thing, and I would go home and I tell my dad what I learned, to be like, okay, that's bullshit. Here's what really happened. And that was just my childhood. That was just like having a historian who, and the nice thing about he's not a religious scholar, but he is a historian of a religion and a group. He focused more on like, the ethnic struggles of Judaism in the context of what was going on in European history. So it was, he's a European scholar. He's a Russian scholar. He's a French. He can speak 7 languages. He's like a scholar of European intellectual history, first and foremost, but in the context of how Judaism fit into European cultures in that time. So I was raised with a sense that, like, I don't know if my dad meant it this way, but questioning how unique Jewish pain is was always something I had a sensibility for. Like, the idea, like, Hebrew school would teach me that the Holocaust was like a uniquely horrible experience that destroyed Jews, and that was like the worst possible effect. And I don't deny the impact of that. I just didn't have the perspective of other genocides and other ethnic cleansing and other brutal regimes destroying a population. And so that was something where I would contextualize that. And just, my dad was very big on, let's contextualize what's going on with Jews in the world itself without downplaying the pain that they've dealt with over the years. So that was a really influential thing for me. But it gave me a sense that to some extent, the uniqueness of Jews that I was being taught in school conflicted with sort of what my dad, to some extent, taught about. And what his scholarship really contributed to.
Yeah, Jews weren't even the only victims of the Holocaust. We were just 6 million of the 11 million.
Yeah.
I remember I did a Holocaust study abroad program in Berlin. I know how to have fun. And in Berlin, there's a monument to the murdered homosexuals, and I just remember seeing on the map, and it's just like one word, and so German homo monument, and I'm
Yeah.
like, can they say that? But no, that's what it's called. It's the homo monument, and I remember it's in a park, and it's kind of like a giant cube thing, and you look through, and then there's like footage of gay people kissing, which beautiful, happy for them. But yeah, it's smaller. Naturally, ours is bigger. Ours being the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe, which,
Yeah.
if you're not familiar, it became a really popular place for people to take Tinder and Grindr pictures because it's just cool. It's a series of concrete blocks that, unless you read the plaque, you wouldn't know it's a Holocaust monument. So there's a lot of videos of people doing parkour and then having to apologize for it. So this is a PSA. If you're in Berlin, don't do TikTok dances. It's right at Potsdamer Platz. It's big. You can't miss it. The reason why it's big and unavoidable is because it's the Holocaust.
Yeah. I did a summer abroad in Berlin too in 2006. So it was before
Oh my God.
Tinder and TikTok happened, but it was like, I saw people do picnics and just like drink and shoot the shit in this Holocaust museum. And it's I've said the story, just, one of those things that you don't think is weird when you're growing up until you're older and you look back on it. That's weird. I went to Bronx Science, which is a specialized high school in New York, like where Zohran went, for instance.
Amazing!
Notable,
do you know Zohran?
He grew up literally next door to me.
And
in Mahmoud. He grew up next door to me.
This is T.
Yeah, this is T. My dad used to drive Zohran and my brother and sister to high school for like a good year or two. They're buddies. Like it's just so surreal to think about. Like, Zohran was like this weird, goofy kid growing up, and but it was also, I watched his career. I didn't know him that well. It was because I was in college more when my brother and sister were in high school. But it was just like I'd hear these stories about the goofball next door neighbor kid named Zohran.
That's so fun. Yeah, and so was that one of the B'nai Mitzvahs that Zohran talks about attending? Or I guess if they were friends since he was 14. But he's like name-checked Jewish friends, watching 8 Crazy Nights.
Yeah. But also, so it's just surreal to think about. So he was friends with my extremely Jewish family. So that was never a question for me. There's some people who his opinions on Israel, they're like, we love him. We don't think he's anti-Semitic, but there's people in my life who are like, I'm not going to vote for him because of what he feels about that, even though we know he's not anti-Semitic. And then I'm like, watch this blow the fuck up on the front, because even though I was raised with the perspective of my dad, I was raised in an extremely Zionist community, in an extremely Zionist school. So I knew just the levels people will go to protect that. And it was just this kind of dissonance of like having this more realistic history with this sort of just pure cult. I call it a cult-like mentality around Israel and Zionism. And it's really surreal. Yeah.
I'm a very competitive person. So I wrote down like you were ahead of the curve by being called a self-hating Jew as a kid. That's huge. A child prodigy.
Yeah.
I didn't get that hate until 2 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I've gotten it, the amount I've gotten it is like exponentially gone up since I've been public about it, which is really only like the last year and a half I've really started to get more public about it. There was like a stretch right after October 7th where I was just like, I'm quitting social media. I'm not doing anything. But that was because of some things I had blind spots for. But just want to go back to a point about weird stuff from childhood that I was talking about. I went to Bronx Science, and Bronx Science. I just want to get this in before we move on. But like Bronx Science has a Holocaust museum connected to the library. It's just like a room with like all this Holocaust materials, and they brag about being the only public school in America with a Holocaust museum. And I would just hang out there
Oh
in
my
free
God.
periods with my friends, like, complaining about math class or our Spanish teacher, something like that, with the most horrific imagery you've ever seen in your life, like surrounding us. And it was just like, that was a thing I considered
Oh my
normal as a
gosh.
kid. And then it's just like, wait a minute, that is insane. But yeah,
The only public school with a Holocaust museum. That must have been before the paperclip projects. Did you see that documentary?
no, I did not.
My there was this school. I went on a trip with my synagogue in high school to Whitwell, Tennessee, to this middle school that put together a Holocaust memorial. The premise was like, there's a documentary about it, and the teacher was teaching about the Holocaust, and then the kids were like, 6 million? Like, what? That's not that money. And she's like, bet. And they ended up collecting 6 million paper clips
Oh
and
my
then
God.
getting an actual Auschwitz cable car sent to Whitwell, Tennessee, that is now filled with the clips, so you can see just how many paper clips 6 million is. So we went on a trip from my synagogue. We flew into Atlanta from Toronto, stayed at Camp Ramad Darom, and the rabbi was like super conservative, even on the conservative end. So literally, he pulled over on the highway so we could play mincha, pray mincha.
Oh
Um,
man.
yeah, that's so that was less convenient than a Holocaust museum right in the library.
Yeah, it was just super. We would just literally hang out there. But it was like, it like Bronx Science is sort of like in a weird point in its history where, like, through like the 70s or 80s, it was overwhelmingly Jewish. Like, it was like probably 80% Jewish. And when I was there, by the time I got there in the early 2000s, it was like 70% Asian. And that was a mix of like East Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern. But there were Jews there, but no, I don't know, but like, I always say Bronx Science is the high school was the first place I became friends with Muslim kids. Like, I didn't know like my group, my
Mm-hmm.
childhood was like 70-80% Jews. And it wasn't until I got to high school, and it was a public high school, not a Jewish school, where I was like, oh wait, this is fine. Like, I've been told my whole life these are people who want to kill me, but like, we're just high school kids talking about high school stuff. And this was right after 9/11 too. It was just the only place I'd been where it was like, there's no line. And so that was another awakening moment for me, was that like, I don't, I was taught, I don't know if I was taught Islamophobia, but I was taught that people who look a certain way and think a certain way want me dead. And that was just not my experience
Wow.
when I first encountered people who looked like that or were like that. But I was afraid to talk about the issue with them, because I was just like, oh, I'm going to be afraid as a Jew to talk about this with them. And it wasn't until really the last 2 years where I was starting to listen to perspectives of Muslim people. And I'd heard some things about like the history, not just recently, like going back to the 70s and the 6 Day War and the 40s. It was just things I didn't want to hear, because they made me sad and made me like, I sort of put them in a part of my brain and let them sit there. And then like, once I was starting to hear more and seeing what's happening now, it sort of all came flooding back. All these things that I'd heard that were sort of rumors in the community I was raised with growing up.
Like what? Like yeah, the word occupation.
We go occupation, like
What like what were the
cutting off food and electricity, which has been going on over stretches since the 70s at the very least. I was told the 6 Day War in 67 was like a heroic act, and I was like, no, this actually violated so many international laws and was just like betrayed, everything that this tended, very Eurocentric agreement was supposed to even protect from. I didn't know about the Nakba until the last 2 years. Like, I'd not heard the word Nakba until I had talked about it in the show. Like, just that word had never entered my lexicon. But I was like, I was like, I don't, and part of it was just my ignorance and just like my lack of connection to my Judaism through completely independent of Israel means, which is like, I don't really care about this anymore. I've had a lot of trauma with it. I don't want to talk about it. But it was just like, oh, it was always like, I've heard this is fucked up, but I don't want to look into it. And then when you look into the Nakba and the real history of it, and the whitewashing of it in Western media, and in Jewish media as well, in Jewish culture as well, it was just like, no, this is horrific. This is on the level of what Jews had to deal with around the same time. And that was just something that was completely whitewashed from my education. And I just like, I don't know how many times I went to Holocaust lectures as a kid or was taught about the Holocaust. I didn't have a single day where I learned about the Nakba or what Palestinians have gone through. And that's like really what upsets me. And that in when I think about it. And that's just, I don't want to be like too critical of the Jewish community, because I know there's a lot of diversity in the Jewish community. But it is the kind of thing where I'm like, let's talk about how we're educating ourselves. And that's something that we need to talk.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the last 2 years we've seen what happens. Like the dehumanization is, I, to say it's because of a lack of education is probably too optimistic, than implying that, like, okay, if people learn, then they'll be able to see other people's humanity. But it certainly didn't help. Like,
Yeah.
being told people are dangerous and want to kill you, even if they're in Morningside Heights, and literally just the dude who's running for mayor.
Yeah. Who's at the time was more of a
Yeah, that
rapper than a
it just not
politician.
help.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was your educational process like? Like, are there any particular your books, or um like in the what was the research process for writing the show?
Yeah. I mean, when I talk about the show, and I think one of the things I may have struggled to market with earlier is that the show is like maybe 30% about Israel, maybe, and a lot of it's just about my Jewish upbringing, and some of the ways my care was mismanaged in the world I was raised in. You were saying, yeah, sorry, you were
Oh,
going
so
on.
you're saying that Israel Oh, you were saying that Israel and Jewish upbringing, those are two different things. It's not one and the same.
Well, yeah, I don't think they are. I think there was a sense growing up
Yeah.
that like you're going to visit Israel at some point. You're going to have an experience in Israel. You're gonna if you're Jewish, you need to have a connection with Israel to some extent. But my experience was just more dealing, and like I never got into it with people because I would always sort of defer to my dad. And until recently, my opinions on the issue were like whatever my dad's the scholar, he knows better. Like let me just defer to him. Um, which is just, yeah, I think that's a natural thing to do when you have a father who's as like esteemed in that field as mine is. But there was a sense that like, but I had issues with the Jewish community and trauma from that had nothing to do with Israel. Like I just had issues with like medical care I received, you know, wealth, bullying, like, and the kind of stuff I talk about that on the show. And it's not, and it's just something where I don't think I would be able to have the capacity, given the way I was raised, to have this kind of perspective that I have now, if my experience with the Jewish community, completely independent of Israel, wasn't as fraught as it was growing up. I think the fact that I had this sort of outcast perspective in the community I was raised in gave me like an opening to see another way of approaching this issue. But with the show, I go into the depths of like trauma I was raised with, the one time I visited Israel, and sort of like, well, this is not what I thought it was, but I wasn't really as invested in it as I was told I had to be. And that was sort of a weird cognitive dissonance thing there. Coming to terms with my grandfather, who I always say was like one of the most liberal representatives in the state house in Massachusetts, with this one exception around this issue. And so it's really, there was just a lot, like my community, like I always say, like you look at the patterns of how bullying was treated in the Upper West Side in the 90s, which was like 90% Democrat at the time, and you look at the parallels of how Democrats let Republicans bully everything. There's a lot of parallels between my personal, how I was like, the way bullies were supposed to be handled and were not in the community I was raised in, with what's going on in politics now. Like, the whole ignore them when they go low, you go high stuff, which is we've learned is just the disaster for the Democratic Party. That was how I was taught to be handle bullies, and like with the Democrats, it didn't work. So it was just like a whole coming to terms with that line of thinking. Yeah,
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I grew up in Toronto and just idealizing life in New York. So it's funny. I thought of to me the Upper West Side is how people think about Israel. I'm like, this is the Jewish homeland, the utopia where
yeah,
you can be yourself and free. And you're telling me there's violence there?
yeah. There's violence emotionally, violence physically, I don't even know if I should say this, but I just watched a documentary called "Who Killed the Montreal Expos," which is about the baseball team, the Montreal Expos, and how
Oh,
they were
mm-hmm.
forced out of Montreal. Where my dad's from Montreal, so I was like, oh, and I grew up like sitting in my grandmother's basement watching baseball games in French and just being like the novelty of this. So I was just thinking this has nothing to do with my upbringing, but then one of the executives in the of like one of the guys who became the owner of Montreal Expos, who in the documentary is like the biggest slime ball you could possibly imagine, like just like sleaze bucket of a person. His wife was my kindergarten teacher, and she would do
Oi.
things. So that was just like, oh, okay. I thought I was just watching this completely nothing with childhood trauma documentary. And then it's like, oh, right. That was my kindergarten teacher who once wouldn't let me go to the bathroom and led me to pee myself in kindergarten in front of a class where I was already being bullied a lot. And so I'm like, oh, that's her husband just on top of that destroyed the baseball in Montreal. So, okay, that just happened this week, some random trauma trigger that I didn't even think about until I was exposed to it. So, but just like trying to be more honest about like the intensity of the emotion and the trauma I have with this world that like, and a lot of it's like, how entertainment, we know Seinfeld, we knew Woody Allen movies before we weren't allowed to, but it was like, but like that world and like even 30 Rock
Yeah.
to some extent. And like, but when you think of Jewish humor, the Upper West Side and Jewish like culture, the Upper West Side is like what you think of in a lot of contexts. But that's also not all of Judaism. And that's one thing I'm really like been exposed to recently is just like, there's such a thing as poor non-white Jews, and that was not something I knew growing up, was just the idea that like there's lower class, like I never encountered that. It was all rich Ashkenazi, like very successful, like accomplished Jewish people. And when you're not from there, you think, oh, this is like you said, like I've heard this so many times, but your perspective, like this is paradise. This is where like the best Jews end up. But for me, I was sort of born. It was like I was like
Mm-hmm.
Bane. I'm like I'm born into it, but it's just like, and it was just like a very different experience. Like especially in the '90s, where it was just like there was wealth and all the problems that come with like wealth and being raised in an entitled culture. Um, but it was relatively like because we're Jewish, it was somehow different than privilege and so there was like a sense we got to protect our kids because they're persecuted, and all I saw was wealth and bullying and cruelty. So I didn't have the like perspective that that was anything else but that growing up.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it's I'm glad, yeah, you're talking about it because there's for the kids currently there who feel like lonely outcasts. It's funny that growing up in Jewish Toronto, the only person I've seen talk about how they grew up only around Jews is Drake. There's
Yeah,
an interview with Drake in 2008 where he's just like fresh out of Degrassi, and he's like, yeah, I had a bar mitzvah. Like I went to a Jewish school. Like all my friends are Jewish. And I'm like, that was my childhood represented by Drake.
yeah.
So yeah, he did not start from the bottom.
Yeah, yeah. It's I have some jokes that I'm not going to say on this podcast because they're from 2013 and I wouldn't say them now. But there were like but we know Drake has been properly handled by Kendrick Lamar, which is interesting because I live in LA and it's like, oh, this is I've become a Toronto versus LA thing. But especially with the World Series didn't help that either. So yeah,
Yes.
but yeah, no, it's surreal. Like I just look at all these like that was not the only person in my childhood who was connected to someone who owned a sports team. Like this is like there were three people, including this person, my kindergarten teacher, who like were owners of sports teams in my life. And so it's just just the level of wealth and privilege. It was just like my mom's a lawyer. She was a very successful lawyer. So I'm not going to say I grew up middle class. I was like, what I always say is like, I was definitely in the 1% growing up, but I wasn't in the 0.0001%, but that was everywhere in my youth. And just seeing that around and seeing that level, I was like, oh, there's a different stratosphere that I'm working with. And so the way we feel about billionaires now is like, I feel like a lot of people are new to that, but that's something I was familiar with at like an extremely young age, just like the level of poison that scale of wealth can have.
That's so interesting. And it's would you say there's a connection like that it's just like made people even more insular? Like they see Zoran not as a threat not only because he's Muslim but also because he wants to raise their taxes. Like are the people you grew up with being incredibly normal online?
I mean, I don't talk to most of the people I grew up with, just because like I have like that's other than my family, like there's very few people in my life right now who I still am connected with who knew me before I was 18. And there was definitely like when I was living in New York, like after college and was just starting to do comedy and open micing, there was like I was at the end of my rope in New York. Like I don't even know if people like who were connected to in the New York comedy scene knew just how like miserable and depressed I was. And a lot it was just tied to like and I was learning things about my childhood and then like coming to terms with things, but it was just like, I hate the city. I hate the subway. I don't want to be delayed anymore. I don't want to be rerouted. I don't want to have a stranger fall asleep on me. I don't want to smell this shit everywhere. And it's just like, fuck this, fuck. And I was just really like at the end of it. So LA was like a paradise, which is ridiculous now that I've been here for 12 years. But it was just, I remember I was like having a
Wow.
meltdown on the subway and there was a comedian friend like who I knew in the world who's like the sweetest, like, uh, you know, comedian woman, and she just saw me have this meltdown. I didn't, I was having it and independently. I just looked up at her. I was like, hey, I was like totally coincidentally, she was on the subway. I was like, how's it going? And I just had this like breakdown, but it was just New York beat me up. And I think it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized like how traumatic things were for me there. And I think in terms of like the community I was raised in, like, I was raised in New York, the New York City private school circuit, and I'm like, if I meet someone who is raised in that and they're not hostile to that, or they don't like know the trauma of that, I just don't trust them. Like I've literally been on people like when I was living in New York, like, or even here, I was like, oh yeah, I went to Fieldston for high school, and I'm like, oh, how was it for you? And it was like, it's fine, and then I enjoyed it. Then I didn't message him back. Like that's the level of like trauma I have with that. It's just like if it's I only trust people from my world who were not happy with it, which is not like a healthy attitude, but it's just how I'm wired, just based on the way I was raised.
Me too. This is very validating because my oldest friends are from freshman year of college.
Yeah,
Though it's so much so that and since I moved to New York, every time someone moves to New York from Toronto or from my childhood, my mom's like, "Oh, you gotta show them around." And I'm like, I don't know if they want to talk to me. They didn't talk to me when we lived in the same place. So I started something called the donut rule. And that was if someone I had met before 2011 reached out to me first, like initiated the contact, then I would take them out for a donut. So two people from my childhood, someone ended up going to grad school at the new school, bought them a donut at the donut plant, and someone from Camp Rama and my elementary school who moved to New York for a bit to try music and isn't here anymore, but they did get their donut while
yeah,
they were here. It was enough of a phenomenon that I was like, okay, I'll see if you initiate contact, and if you did, you get a donut. But if I advertised it, then people would
yeah.
reach out to me just for the free donut.
Yeah, and I still relate to that. Like, I
Are
talked in the show I was about this. Like, what I went to college in Chicago at the University of Chicago, and I did not really have any New York friends in college. Um, I had friends from like the Midwest and South mostly. Like those are it's just people from small towns because it was just like a novelty to me. Like, wait, you're from a place where not everyone is obscenely wealthy, and you are like you. This was like an accomplishment, a huge like source of hard work to get here, as opposed to like, oh, I'll go to a nice college because that's how I was raised, and I'm a good student, so of course that's going to happen. And like, and there's people in my high school and elementary school who like went to Stanford or Penn or Brandeis, and I would just think about them like, you were like the dumbest person in my school. You were like, had no intellectual curiosity. You were like just totally vapid, and you got into Stanford, you got into Penn, you got into Brandeis. Like, what? So that was just like, that was the world I was raised in. But people were like, oh yeah, I'm the first person in my high school, in my family, to go to college, or oh, I'm like one of like 5 people in my high school who didn't get pregnant at 18. Like, that was just like, oh, that's
Wow.
new information to me. And like, I gravitated to, I realized like I gravitated to people who are like still my friends, and I still like have nothing but respect and adore them. But one of the reasons I was so attracted to their personalities was it was nothing like how I was raised. That's important. And so like, I go back to New York, and like I spend like a few days in the Upper West Side. I have to go to a library bar on Lower East Side and get hammered. Like, I just have to like be my 20s dirtball self again, because like I can, it's just so much. It's just a lot to handle, and it's not the fault of my family. It's just so much of like, I just get associate. Oh, people. I had a new psychiatrist recently, and she's like, "Did you have a happy childhood?" And I was just like, no. I just was like, no, not even close. But it's just like, I just gravitate to people who have either are from a completely different world than me, or not from a rich family specifically, or were from a similar world to me, but were just like, had like trauma with this. Or like, one of the things I've worked on is like, when I meet a new Jewish person, I don't want to be like suspicious of what their opinions on Israel are. I really don't. That's not something I don't want to have like, like, okay, with Jewish people in general, because that's shitty, and I don't want to be that way. So I've had to work on like, making sure that when I meet, get in a situation where there's someone Jewish, I have to like just be like do some like somatic body work, just to be like, okay, this is fine. Don't judge, don't bring it up, just treat them as a human being, and don't talk about that. If they initiate and they go for it, that's another story. And that happens a lot when someone's like, oh, you're Jewish too, you're Jewish too. So this is fucked up, what's happening there, right? And I'm like, yes, let's talk. I'll just let them talk about how they think it's fucked up, and adjust accordingly. But I just don't want to like go into a conversation where I'm like, I'm distrustful of someone because they were raised similar to me, unless they are open about their trauma, which I shouldn't. Like, it's something I've really had to like adjust my attitudes on, and make sure I'm being positive about, and not assuming the worst when I meet someone new or talk to someone I've known who for years, who I haven't talked about this with, for instance.
And it's interesting. It's like the trope of when Americans go abroad and pretend to be Canadians.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if that's a good thing. Like, yes, I'm Jewish, but I don't support this. It's like, yes, I'm Canadian, but I voted for Mark Carney.
Yeah.
Do you ever get like shit about being an American?
Well, I mean, I haven't gone abroad that much, but I do, in at least since college. I went abroad like all the time as a kid, but it was just like, but I mean, my dad's from Montreal. I have a Canadian passport. I'm planning on moving to Toronto, ironically, next year, just for like personal purposes, with no, just for what's the next step for my life. My family's on the East Coast, and my wife's family's from there too. So we want to be closer to family, but not too close, and in a place where there's something resembling a
Yes.
social safety net, for next stages of life. But it's really just like, so I have a Canadian passport that I could bring out and be like, no, no, I swear, I'm not just pretending to be. I have this passport. My dad's from Montreal. I could, when I go to Côte Saint Luc and talk about that, I can talk about that all day. Cavendish Mall, all that, where I think they filmed Are You Afraid of the Dark? But that's just my childhood, like when I visit my grandmother's stopping grounds. So I could, and so I don't really, I don't like when go abroad, which has been limited in the last few years. Just I've gone to more like weird states than abroad randomly. Um, and if I go to there, it's been to Canada more often than not, either to visit family or for other reasons. But I'm just like, let's talk about. I just try to leave it open. I'm just like, let's talk about what we don't like about here,
Hmm.
what you don't like about where you are. I'm not moving to Toronto with like, this is paradise, this is Valhalla. I'm not moving there with that sort of thinking about it. I'm just sort of thinking, what's best for me in the next stage of my life, what's best for my family in the next stage of our life, and that's what makes sense. It helps I have a passport, but it's really just, I'm not a nationalist. I don't in any sense either for like I don't care what country you're from. I don't have a connection to a country. And I also know through my dad that nationalism is an extremely recent, relatively in history, phenomenon. It's like 150 years old, the concept of nationalism. It's not something that 300 years ago anyone would be like, I'm Ukrainian or I'm French or I'm Austrian. Like that's just a, a new concept, of course, of history. And I don't really have a connection to America or Canada or Poland, which I have a passport for too. I got 3 passports, a couple of visas. But I do know my own name. But but yeah, it's I don't know. I just feel like I try to judge people on a conversation we have and let this is something also my grandfather really taught me. It's just meet people at their level and don't just trust people. Go to people with trust initially, and then if they're not they prove themselves to be not someone you want to deal with, then that's fine.
That's interesting. I like that point about nationalism because in researching this podcast, doing this podcast, it's called War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. And with the exception of sports and the Olympics, like nationalism has mostly just served to make people hate each other and become excuses for violence. Like,
and also sports too. Like I'm a sports fan.
Societies exist. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not unique there. I don't see a good thing for nationalism. I mean, the only thing I could see, like, there is a cause for people to have determination over how they want to be ruled, but that's not, and the way it's ruled now is like, just in the way society works now is tied to nationhood to some extent. So I'm in favor of the general concept of people having the ability to determine the kind of government they want to have. But I also like don't care if that's defined by nations or local or states or like provinces, whatever it is. I just want people to be taken care of and have what their needs met and have a healthy, prosperous life. And I overall don't see nationalism or the concept of nations as a good goal for that, good end game for that to happen. Does that make
All
me
right,
a radical
I think we
anarchist?
have a new
I don't
name
know.
for the episode because
Yeah.
A radical anarchist, or there have been moments where the president, when he's talked about wanting to annex Canada, has said, like, what are borders anyway? Just arbitrary lines made up. Like, so ironically, like, he's so nationalist that he's come all the way around to saying, like, this is all fake and made up.
Yeah. It's wild. The shit that comes out of his mouth is just like, when it's accidentally radical, that's the only time I can laugh at it, when it's just like, oh, you've gone so far to crazy town that occasionally 2 opinions are going to be close to something that's like the opposite of what your actual politics are. But it's surreal. But yeah, I'll just tell this funny story. My dad got, when I was telling him I was thinking of moving, he got me a hat that said Canada is not for sale, but it was like a red hat in the same MAGA font. And I'm just like, well, I can't wear this. Thank you for giving me this. There's literally no way I can wear this outside. People will see the back and they'll see the font. They won't read it. So this is useless, but thank you. It's a sweet gift. But it was just like, but yeah.
It's merely decorative. My mom also, like, for all of the 2019 Raptors championship season, had a red Raptors hat because that's one of their colors. But then when she comes to visit, we're like, Mom, you can't wear that red hat.
Yeah.
Like, people will cross the street. The logo isn't sufficiently comforting. You can't tell from far away.
Yeah. I just remember thinking, my dad went to London. I'm a big Arsenal soccer club fan, and he got me and Arsenal is like a red and white. He got me a very red Arsenal hat with a similar color, and I'm like, again, thank you. I can't wear this outside. I can wear a shirt with them, but I can't wear anything with them, in a hat form at the very least.
That's so funny. There was a story in the show that I wanted to talk about, which involves Kinder eggs and a kibbutz.
Yeah.
Because if you want to give us the shortened version and the message, because the message about the generational differences and chocolate-based Zionism resonated with me because growing up, a lot of my memories in Israel are chocolate related, come to think of it. I wrote it down. Elite is the name of a chocolate bar. You only went once. I went once a year. Once again, very competitive. But I'm like, we got to get the chocolate with the Pop Rocks in it. it's literally chocolate that like has the popping chocolate or popping candy.
Yeah.
And then there's also Milky's pudding for breakfast. I was like, yay, I'm so excited to go to Israel so I can have pudding with whipped cream for breakfast. And now I'm just like, I hope everyone has the privilege to have breakfast.
Yeah. It's yeah,
But
so
yes,
so the basic story is like my trip to Israel was 2 weeks long. I was 11, and the Cliff Notes version of this part of the story. There's other elements, but we visited a kibbutz where my parents have a friend, and me and my brother were being shithead older brother, younger brother. So they're like, just go stay at our friend's place. We'll just hang out with our friend for an hour, just to be with our friend. And me and my brother and sister went off to get some chocolate Kinder eggs, which I always say is like with a little toy in it. Like it's just not a good chocolate, but at the time we were like, this is great, chocolate and toy, like this is fantastic. So I like led my brother and sister on a odyssey to go back to the I guess mess hall of the kibbutz, get chocolate and Kinder eggs, and work our way back to my parents' friend's place, which was totally like, we were none the wiser. But my parents came back before we got back and were like, oh, our 3 children are all missing, and the terrorists got them. There were sirens going off the kibbutz that were not related to anything going on, but it was just like they didn't know that. So they're like, they were freaking the fuck out. And so it was like one of those things where it's just like the politics, the assumption is clearly they've been taken, they've been kidnapped. It's going to be we're going to be on CNN for the next week. That was like from my understanding, that was their impression. But it was just like, no, we just wanted some chocolate. And it was just like this idea of like, this land has a special, and like the larger metaphor of it is like, this land has a special significance, and it's deeply political. It's deeply connected to who you are as a person. And anything that goes wrong is like a crisis. And I mean, at least for me, and my brother should have been back since, so that was the only time I was there. But I was just like, I'm just trying to be a freaking 11-year-old and just live my 11-year-old life. And 11-year-olds like chocolate and toys, and like being able to watch TV in a language they understand, and having things to do. And it was just like, again, with like lack of like an understanding of why a specific nation should matter to me, any nation, why I should have this connection to it. I don't know if it's just trauma induced or just like there's nothing in my brain that ever connected with that. And that was something that I'm like, this is weird. I just wanted chocolate, and why does it have to be connected to a
yeah.
politics of it, like that kind of thing? So yeah, but I do know that like my parents would bring that back when they would visit Israel, and I'd be like, ooh, good candy. Maybe I'll go back for that too, or at least bring some back next time you're there. But yeah,
Yeah, it's funny, Trader Joe's does have dupes of multiple things. So if you really want butnim Americain, which are just like these like candied peanuts, you could go to Trader Joe's. And yeah, Bisley, Bumba, that yeah, chocolate propaganda.
yeah. Well, I've heard this, like, food and like, even on Birthright, like where the joke is people go there to get hand jobs from other Jews, that kind of thing. It's just like food, sex, money are all like base needs, and they're all like the simple. I don't think this is insignificant to say or frivolous. Like, simplest things are what get people hooked on Israel, and I think that's by design. It's just to like like my dad always says, Birthright was first designed to get Jews to stop intermarrying. Like, that was its initial purpose, was to get Jews to marry other Jews. And now it's become this whole, monster in of itself. But that's like, base needs are like tied to this land by design. So I don't think that's like a frivolous point at all.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so, yeah, what I took away from the show is that, like, whereas things like nation states are frivolous, made up, like it's the family connections are very real, very tangible, the most important thing in the world. So that's why, do you know people, or have you seen like literally families being torn apart over Israel? I'm like, doesn't that negate the purpose? Like, wasn't the purpose of peoplehood and bringing people together, but now you're not talking to your children anymore because of their politics? Like, Has that been an issue?
I mean, for my family, my immediate family, no. There's extended family that I know that's been a huge issue for them. And like my relationship with certain cousins has been deeply affected by this and certain aunts and uncles. And I still have a relationship with them. I've not cut off anyone in my family personally, and I don't want to. I don't ever want to, even like my cousins, things like that.
Hmm.
But it is something where there's been a distance between them. Like, this is, I have so many friends who are Jewish who like have either completely cut off their parents or their siblings or had them cut them off for their politics. So it's a lot of people like uh, who are Jewish anti-Zionists don't want to not have a relationship with their family, but their families are so deep in it that they're just like that they cut them off, and that's tragic too. But for me, at least, like especially with my extended family, there's just a distance there, and it's like it's not like no
Mm.
contact, but it's just like a sense of like I can't have the same bond with you and the same kind of like deep into connection with you, familial, like soft warm connection with you, because I know this is where you stand. And that's, beyond like the most extreme cases, that's tragic in and of itself, that this issue can not just cause like you know literal disconnection, but also just like a certain level of emotional disconnection. And it's just sad to think about sometimes, just to see like s- you know I think for every no contact situation there is within Jewish families as well as this, there's 10 just like souring of connections. And that's just really sad for me to think about. And I feel like the only most of the people I know who are like the strongest committed to their family, but also have similar politics to us, are people whose f- parents raised them with that. Like I have people who are very close to their family
Mm.
who are raised deeply anti-Zionist by Jews, and it's weird to me to think that, like in my family, like the people who are considered the most loyal happen to be the most Zionist, and the people who are the least Zionist in my extended family are generally considered the selfish ones. And that's sad
Oh,
to me, but I feel
interesting.
like and it's just like, yeah, it's surreal to think about, like, how everyone's like, "Oh, you're so loyal," and I'm like, "I know what your politics are," that kind of thing, and it's really sad to think about, but that's not the case. Like, I know people who are incredibly close to their family, who have these differences and are able to talk it out and have patience more than I like saints, probably more than patience than I have, but there's also people who, like, were raised with Jewish families who are just like it's weird that the safest way to have a bond with your Jewish family, if you believe that this is not right fundamentally, are people whose families also believe that. Like the disconnection with is the untying of Jewish life and Jewish family life to Israel is really ultimately, I think, the best way to maintain that connection with your family is. But there's so many people, especially of like my parents' generation, who like are attached to Israel through their parents and through their families. Like Israel is their family as much as their actual family is. And if that's the case, it's like you're spiting their family, their brother, their sibling, their parents. Like if you're saying Israel shouldn't do what it's doing, or should never have existed the way it does. Um, it's just tragic to think about, just like how much families are destroyed by this. And like I've had so many friends in my life where like, yeah, I can't talk to my brother, I can't talk to my mom, and it's just where people are like, yeah, I just need to set boundaries with them. It's like, and it just sours everything. It just makes me sad to think about.
Yeah, I need a new therapist because my therapist only wants to talk about Israel precisely because I think because he's a boomer, he has no one else in his life to talk about. So he's like, "Yay, I have a progressive millennial patient." And I'm like, "You need this more than I do. Like you should start paying me." But
Yeah, I
yeah,
chose
it's very hard to.
yeah, my new therapist, I switched therapists about a year ago, and I specifically was like, I don't want an old Jewish man. I really don't want an old Jewish man to be I've had old Jewish men as my therapist my whole life, so I got a queer
Mhm.
Muslim woman who's younger than me, and and she's able to process this shit with, and like she deals with religious trauma. She's great. I love my therapist, but I consciously chose to go with someone who's not an old Jewish man, and maybe the opposite of old Jewish man to some extent. But yeah,
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you recommend it? I wonder, I know you're in LA, so I wonder if yeah, she does virtual. I'll wake up early if I need to.
yeah, I'll
Yeah. Thank you. The people have the chutzpah to like call us bad Jews, yet here we
yeah.
are comparing therapists.
Yeah.
This is what
It's
community
also,
is all about, not about,
yeah,
oh,
it's
go
also
for
like,
it.
look at me, look at my face, look at my hair, look at the,
Yeah.
everything I was raised in. You're not, look at who my family is. Like, people online are like, you're not really a Jew. And I'm like, I couldn't be more Jewish if I tried. Like that kind of thing. Like if I always say like, do you want to do a 23andMe? I'm like, I could do that, or I could set $100 on fire because it will just come back Ashkenazi, Ashkenazi,
Yeah.
Ashkenazi. Like there's no like, this is what I am, and I'm not denying that this is what I am. And I don't, anyone who says that if I don't believe in Israel, I'm less of a Jew. And I even like, and I'll say like, even people who are like on the anti-Zionist side of the spectrum on Judaism, if they're like, this person's not, doesn't care about Judaism and they're a Shonda or they're a fake Jew because they don't believe in this, I'm like, I don't want to tell anyone how to be a Jew because I've been told I'm not a Jew if I don't believe this my whole life. So I don't want that going the other way either. I don't think the most rabid right-wing Trumpy Zionist is any less of a Jew than me, nor they'll think I'm less of a Jew than them, but I'm not going to throw that back at them, even though like I find their politics heinous and I don't want anything to do with them. The fact that they're Jewish means like doesn't mean I should have any difference of opinion for me for how I think about them, but I don't consider them any less of a Jew than me. I think that's a weird distinction to have on any front.
Yeah. And you mentioned like birthright existing so people wouldn't intermarry. So it's like, can you afford to turn people away, to draw these firm lines in the sand and tell people they're not Jewish? Like, no, numerically, that's not very smart.
Yeah, and I have a friend from
Like, we
college who's
can't all be Kushners and get supermodels
yeah.
to
I have
convert.
this friend from college who told me the story about when he visited the Western Wall um, for the first time. And I think people who are not Jewish and are not from like New York or LA don't know the phenomenon of being asked, "Are you Jewish?" on the street, and like what that is. But he went to the Western Wall because that's what you did. Politically, that's a nightmare to do when you think about like the politics of Israel and the negotiations and how Jerusalem has been like a constant like point of no return for any kind of negotiations, no matter how much progress was made. So going to the Western Wall is pretty fucked up thing to do, but everyone who's Jewish, from America who goes on their trip to Israel does it.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. Can you expand on that? Like in terms of, yeah, you mentioned the 6 Day War, like
Yeah, I mean, it's just the idea that like this is Jerusalem is really the hot, like in the negotiations in like Camp David in like the late '90s when Clinton was like at the end of his presidency, which were maybe like the closest we've gotten, at least since the Oslo Accords in '93, to like lasting peace there. That's what broke down the negotiations, was the idea of who controls Jerusalem and who controls that specific region of Jerusalem. And Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, just that was the point. Like he was giving, it wasn't close enough to where I am, but it was like would have led to at least some kind of not violence in this, to some extent. In a way, there's been less violence there, but he was willing, this right-wing monster was willing to make a lot of concessions that you never thought someone in his like political stance would make, but he would not budge on control of that specific region of Jerusalem, and that's what caused those negotiations to collapse. And all that happened in the 2000s, early 2000s, in some extent, were due to the breakdown of those negotiations at the end of the Clinton administration. And I mean, I was visiting there like in '97, so we weren't at that point yet. But that's always been like the one line that will never be crossed, even when things have been close. Is the Western Wall set? I forget which section it is in Jerusalem. I don't claim to know, like, be an expert on that, but I just know that's the line that's never crossed. So going there is really not something you should be doing if you're like a leftist of any extent or just progressive of any extent. My friend went there, and all these far right Jewish supremacists approached him and asked him to do prayers. It's like, no, I'm just doing this because I'm supposed to do this. My group's here. I'm secular, and they just said secular Jews are worse than Hitler. That's literally a thing that was said to my friend, was just
holy
like
shit.
by these like Kahanas people at the Western Wall who were like going, and that's just like, that's not like, that's horrific in a vacuum, but that's not like too far removed from the kind of normal attitudes that I grew up with, like, and or just like heard.
Wow.
Um, and that's just like a natural extension of the kind of ways that issue was approached to me. It's a very extreme expression, but it's not like inconsistent to some extent. It's just the extreme like end of what was presented to me as a kid.
And also, yeah, the irony of saying secular Jews are worse than Hitler, but then also don't compare any genocides to the Holocaust. The Holocaust is sacred and special. Like, Like, what is it? Like, can Hitler just be used to toss around to anyone you don't like, or no?
Yeah, I think there's just I don't think this is unique to Jews. I think pretty much every group, ethnic, national, religious, whatever identity has like tunnel vision over everything has to relate to what our experience. And so I think there's no, like, if you are the kind of person who thinks this is unique to Jews, it doesn't matter if Jews do a similar thing somewhere else, because this is something that happened to Jews, and Jews, like, were, I don't know, like, I think about like another friend of mine, who's like bonding with the story. He's talked about someone who he grew up with, who was like the last, he had, was, well, the only one of his 8 siblings not to be slaughtered and like not to die in the Holocaust. He survived. He came to America. Every single his other siblings
Wow.
was killed. And they asked him, like, what do you think of what's going on in Israel and Palestine? And he was like, Bibi is right, kill them all. And it's just like, you literally had your family slaughtered by that. So I think it's just the idea of like, if you don't think in terms not how you were raised, and like I said, this is not specifically a Jewish concept. This is, I think, a human concept to some extent. If you don't think outside of those terms, anything goes for people who are not in your line, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is some advice as you move to Toronto. Leafs fans, they will say no one has ever suffered more than us.
I'm a Rangers fan. They can go to hell. That kind of thing. So yeah. Rangers
Oh,
fan, yeah.
oh my gosh.
So I was an 8-year-old boy
Be
in New York.
careful.
Yeah, no, I know it's gonna be bloody. That will be, all my anti-Zionism won't get any tear gas, but maybe my Rangers fandom will. So we'll see. But yeah, I was an 8-year-old boy in New York with a Canadian dad in 1994. It's gonna happen. But yeah,
That was when Gretzky was on the Rangers?
that's when they won the Stanley Cup for the only time in the last 90 years. So like,
Oh my
I
God,
get it.
wow.
Like, I have that memory of like when I was 8, all my sports joy peaked, and I will be suffering ever since because of how much joy I had when I was 8 years old. But I've accepted this, and my wife's like, "You are in an abusive relationship with sports." I'm like, "Yeah, that's how it works." But yeah,
Oh, so then you'll fit right in.
yeah, that's the thing.
That's
I
very
know
much a
pain, so I know sports
Torontonian
pain. So yeah,
mentality.
yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of Toronto, so when are you doing this show? So I think this will come out in December. So tell us where and when people can catch the show.
Yeah, so I'm doing it. I'm not leaving LA just yet. So I'm doing 2 versions of the show in LA. If you're listening from LA, I'm doing it at the Crow Theater in Santa Monica in the West Side on January 21st. And then I'm doing it at the Lyric Hyperion, which is in Silver Lake, sort of the eastern part of LA, a week later on January 28th. I tried to give everyone in LA, because no one likes to go to the other side of LA ever. So I try to give both sides of LA
Yeah,
a space to see the show. So January 21st at the Crow in Santa Monica, January
that's
28th.
beautiful.
Yeah, Lyric. I'm very open-minded and open to this. So January 28th at the Lyric Hyperion, and then I'm doing it in Toronto, shortly after we're planning on getting there on May 9th at the Assembly Theater. That's in the west side of Toronto as well. So yeah, the information, if you go to jewinterrupted.com, all the information is there. I'll do the whole spiel. You can also find me on social media at Ethan Stan Comedy, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. I don't do Twitter anymore. I refuse to call it X. But yeah, so that's where to find me. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening and or watching War is Stupid, an anti-war podcast about war. Please subscribe, rate and review. Tell your dads. We'll see you next time.